They burned Grace Whitaker's barn because they thought fire could scare an old black woman off her own land, but before the sun came up, every man who laughed at those flames would learn they had just chosen the wrong farmer. The sky over Whitaker Farm glowed orange just after midnight, the kind of ugly, hungry orange that turned fence posts into shadows and made the pine trees look like witnesses standing still in the dark. Flames climbed through the roof of the old barn, eating through cedar beams her father had raised with his own hands 40 years earlier. Inside were feed sacks, winter tools, a broken tractor Caleb had been trying to fix, and the old family saddle Grace's mother had refused to sell even when the bank came knocking. Outside the fence line, 3 black SUVs idled on the dirt road with their headlights off. Mateo Vargas stood beside the lead vehicle in a pressed white shirt, smiling like a man admiring work well done. One of his men lifted a phone and recorded the fire, laughing under his breath. Another kicked at the gravel and said, "Maybe now she'll understand what happens when people like her say no." Grace heard him. She stood 20 yards from her porch in muddy boots, a faded denim jacket, and a gray head scarf tied low across her forehead. She did not scream. She did not run toward the flames. She did not beg them to stop. Her dark eyes reflected the fire, but her face remained still, almost too still, the kind of calm that men like Mateo always mistook for fear. Behind her, 17-year-old Caleb Whitaker gripped the porch rail so tightly his knuckles paled. "Aunt Grace," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We need to call somebody." Grace already had. But not the sheriff's office. Not Deputy Cole Harlan, who had driven past this same road twice that week and pretended not to see the tire tracks near her fence. Not the men in town who lowered their voices whenever Mateo's name was spoken. Grace held her phone low at her side, the screen dim, the recording light hidden beneath her thumb. Across the road, Mateo took one slow step forward, close enough for his voice to carry over the crackling wood. "Last chance, Mrs. Whitaker," he called out. "You sign the land over by tomorrow morning, or next time we don't stop with the barn." Caleb moved like he wanted to shout back, but Grace lifted one hand without looking at him, and the boy froze. Her silence was not weakness. It was discipline. Every word Mateo spoke crossed the dark road, entered the tiny microphone in her phone, and joined the other evidence he never knew existed. The trail cameras in the tree line were still blinking red. The fireproof lockbox under the barn floor was still buried beneath the ash. And somewhere far beyond this county, a federal prosecutor named Naomi Brooks was about to receive the first encrypted file. Mateo thought he had burned Grace Whitaker's leverage to the ground. What he did not know was that Grace had survived worse men in worse places, and fire had just exposed the proof he was trying to destroy. 48 hours before the fire turned the night sky orange, Grace Whitaker was standing in the east pasture before sunrise with a pair of work gloves tucked into the back pocket of her jeans and a dented thermos of black coffee balanced on a fence post. The air was cool for Georgia, just under 50 degrees, and the grass held a silver layer of dew that soaked the toes of her boots as she walked the line of split-rail fencing her father had built long before the county road was paved. She moved slowly, not because age had made her fragile, but because she believed nothing important should be rushed. Every board got checked. Every latch got tested. Every hoofprint near the mud was noticed. Whitaker Farm had belonged to her family since 1949, 112 acres of pine, pasture, corn rows, and stubborn red clay that had survived droughts, bank letters, storms, and men who always seemed to think land meant less when a black woman owned it. Grace had no interest in trouble. She wanted her crops clean, her animals fed, her taxes paid on time, and her nephew Caleb home before dark. That was the life she had built after leaving behind a past almost nobody in Bryan County knew enough to ask about. To the people who saw her at Miller's Feed and Hardware, she was just Mrs. Whitaker, the quiet woman with the straight back and the old blue pickup. She bought seed in bulk, paid cash when she could, said yes ma'am and no sir out of habit, and never stayed longer than business required. Children liked her because she never talked down to them. Older folks trusted her because she listened more than she spoke. Stray dogs followed her because she carried biscuits in the pocket of her coat. If somebody's tractor got stuck after a storm, Grace would show up with chains before they finished calling for help. If a widow down the road needed firewood stacked before the first freeze, Grace would bring Caleb and never mention it afterward. She was not famous, not loud, not interested in being feared. But there were things about her that did not fit the simple picture people had drawn. Grace never parked where she could be boxed in. She never sat in a restaurant with her back to the door. She could hear an unfamiliar engine before the truck appeared over the hill, and she could tell from a single glance whether a man was angry, nervous, lying, or trying too hard to seem friendly. When she walked a field, her eyes did not wander. They measured distance to the tree line. Fresh tire marks near the creek. A broken branch where no storm had passed. A cigarette butt under the north gate when no one on the farm smoked. Caleb used to tease her for it, calling her the most suspicious farmer in Georgia, but Grace would only smile and say, paying attention is cheaper than regret. That morning, Caleb came out of the farmhouse with his backpack slung over one shoulder and a piece of toast in his mouth, late as usual but trying to look innocent. He was 17, tall, bright, and restless, with his mother's eyes and a stubborn streak Grace blamed on every Whitaker who had ever lived. His parents were gone now, one to illness and one to grief that turned into distance, so Grace had raised him the best way she knew how, with chores, honesty, books, and enough love to make rules feel like shelter instead of punishment. Bus comes in 12 minutes, she said without looking at her watch. Caleb stopped mid-step and checked his phone. How do you do that? Same way I know you did not finish the algebra packet. He groaned, but there was affection in it. I was going to do it during lunch. Lunch is for eating. Work is for finishing before it starts chasing you. He rolled his eyes, then kissed her cheek because he knew better than to leave without doing it. Grace handed him a brown paper bag with 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a folded $5 bill tucked under the napkin. Straight home after school, she told him. No stopping at the gas station. No rides from anybody I do not know. And if that gray SUV is near the road again, you call me before you do anything else. Caleb's joking expression faded. You think they are still watching? Grace looked toward the far end of the property, where the dirt road curved through a thin wall of pine trees. Nothing moved there now, but 2 nights earlier she had seen headlights cut low through the dark, slow enough to be curious, quiet enough to be dishonest. I think people who want something for the wrong reasons usually come back, she said. That is all. He wanted to ask more, she could see it in the way his shoulders tightened, but the school bus was already growling near the bend. Grace watched him climb aboard, watched the doors close, watched the bus disappear down County Road 18 before she turned back to the farm. Her morning unfolded with the kind of order she trusted. She fed the horses, checked the chicken coop, repaired a loose hinge on the equipment shed, and made notes in a small green ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer. At 9:30, she drove into town, obeying every speed limit though the road was empty. Briar Crossing looked harmless in daylight, all brick storefronts, church signs, flagpoles, and pickup trucks parked outside the diner. But lately, the town had learned to lower its voice. 3 farms had sold in 6 months. One owner moved to Florida without saying goodbye. Another claimed his barn collapsed from old wiring, though people whispered there had been gasoline smell in the rain. Everyone knew the name Mateo Vargas, but nobody said it loudly. At Miller's feed, Grace loaded mineral blocks and fence staples into a flat cart while Mr. Miller pretended not to watch the black SUV idling across the street. You be careful out there, Grace, he said, keeping his voice low. Some folks have been asking about your back acreage. Folks can ask. These are not regular folks. Grace placed a 50-pound sack of feed onto the cart with steady hands. Then they should be extra careful where they step. Mr. Miller looked at her then, really looked, as if he had heard something under the words he could not name. Grace paid, thanked him, and walked back outside. Across the street, the SUV window lowered 2 inches. She did not stare. She did not flinch. She simply noted the vehicle make, the tinted glass, the county plate frame, and the small crack in the left tail light. By the time she reached her truck, she had memorized all of it. Back at the farm, she unloaded supplies, then walked the tree line behind the barn where the pines grew thick enough to hide almost anything. One by one, she checked the trail cameras mounted high on the trunks, the kind most farmers used for deer and trespassers. Grace used them for both, and for things men did when they believed darkness made them invisible. The tiny red lights blinked exactly as they should. She removed one memory card, replaced it with another, and slipped the first into a metal case no bigger than a deck of cards. Then she stood still for a moment, listening. Whined through pine needles. A hawk overhead. Far off, the low sound of a vehicle slowing near the road and then moving on. Her face revealed nothing. Later, in the farmhouse kitchen, Grace opened the bottom drawer beneath the flour bin and lifted out an old wooden box with brass corners worn dull from years of handling. She did not open it all the way. She only checked that the lock was still secure and that the envelope beneath it had not shifted. Inside were things that belonged to a life she had folded away with care, a faded photograph, a coin in a velvet sleeve, a patch without explanation, and a number written on paper that had never been stored in any phone. Grace touched the lid once, then slid the box back into place. Outside, the farm looked peaceful in the afternoon sun. The barn stood solid. The fields moved green and gold under the breeze. Caleb would be home in an hour, hungry and pretending school had been boring. Everything seemed ordinary, exactly the way Grace preferred it. But when she stepped onto the porch and saw fresh tire tracks pressed into the soft dirt near the north gate, her expression changed only slightly. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. Someone had crossed onto her land while she was gone. Someone wanted her to know they could. Grace knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the track, studied the pattern, and looked toward the road. Then she rose with the same quiet control she had carried all morning. They were testing her. And they had no idea she had spent half her life learning how to let dangerous men reveal themselves before making a single move. By late afternoon, the black SUV Grace had memorized was parked behind a private airstrip 6 miles outside Briar Crossing, where the county road turned to gravel and the pine trees grew thick enough to hide anything from passing eyes. The building beside the runway still had the faded sign of an old crop dusting business, but no plane had dusted crops there in years. Now the hangar doors stayed half closed, the security cameras pointed outward, and men who did not farm loaded sealed crates into trucks that never appeared on any local delivery schedule. Mateo Vargas stood inside the hangar with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching 2 of his men argue over a map spread across the hood of a black pickup. He was not a loud man, not at first. That was part of what made people fear him. Mateo knew how to smile while threatening a man's livelihood. He knew how to lower his voice until a room leaned in, then say something so cold that nobody forgot it. In Briar County, he had learned that fear worked better when it came dressed as business. He called himself an investor. He told people he represented a development group out of Atlanta. He wore polished boots, expensive watches, and shirts too clean for the places he visited. But everyone who had signed one of his contracts understood the truth. Mateo did not buy land. He cornered it. He found farmers who were behind on taxes, widows with medical bills, brothers fighting over inheritance, and families tired enough to believe a low offer was better than another year of pressure. First came the polite visit. Then came the envelope of cash. Then came the reminder that accidents happened in rural places all the time. A tractor could catch fire. A well could go bad. A fence could be cut. A man could wake up to find every gate on his property standing open and his cattle scattered across 2 miles of highway. And when people called the sheriff's office, Deputy Cole Harlan usually arrived with a slow walk, a bored expression, and a report that blamed faulty wiring, careless maintenance, trespassers unknown, or the victim's own bad luck. Cole had been born in Bryan County, raised on Friday night football and the belief that a badge made his opinion sound like law. He was not the sheriff, but he acted like the county belonged to him. He knew which families had power, which ones had money, and which ones could be pressured without consequence. For years, that knowledge had made him useful. To frightened landowners, he was the man who shrugged when they needed help. To Mateo, he was the man who made problems disappear before they became paperwork. Cole told himself he was not corrupt, not really. He said he was keeping peace. He said the county needed investment. He said old farmers who refused progress were standing in the way of jobs. But every month, an envelope appeared in the glove compartment of his patrol car, and every month, Cole took it home without asking what had paid for it. Mateo understood men like Cole better than Cole understood himself. Small power, properly fed, could become more loyal than family. That afternoon, Cole leaned against the hangar wall in uniform, one thumb hooked near his belt, his patrol cruiser hidden behind the building where nobody from town could see it. He watched Mateo's men move crates from one truck to another and pretended not to notice the markings scraped off the sides. "You said the Whitaker place would be handled by now," Mateo said without looking at him. Cole shifted, jaw tightening. "Grace Whitaker is not like the others." Mateo finally turned. His smile was thin. "Everybody is. Like the others when the pressure is right. She is stubborn. Stubborn is temporary." Mateo tapped the map with one finger. "Her back acreage is the cleanest route between the Pine Cut and the county line. No traffic cameras. No neighbors within half a mile. Old logging trail connects straight through. We get that land, we move freely. We do not get it, we keep taking risks on the highway." One of his men, a narrow-faced enforcer named Luis Ortega, laughed under his breath. "She is one woman." Cole glanced at him. "One woman people in town respect." "Respect does not stop fire," Luis said. Mateo raised one hand, and the hangar went quiet. He disliked men who tried to sound cruel before thinking. Cruelty, in his mind, was not a mood. It was a tool. Use it too early, people scattered. Use it too late, people stopped believing you had the nerve. With Grace Whitaker, timing mattered. She owned the last piece of land they needed, and worse, she had started watching. Two of Mateo's drivers had reported small cameras on her tree line. Another had seen her truck parked near the north gate long after midnight, lights off, as if she had been waiting for something. A farmer who watched too closely was irritating. A black woman who refused to lower her eyes when Mateo spoke to her was, to him, an insult. He had built his control on reading fear in people's faces. Grace gave him nothing. That bothered him more than he wanted his men to know. Across the hangar, Preston Vale stepped out of the small office with a tablet in his hand and a silk tie loosened at his throat. Preston owned Vale Renewables, the company whose bright green signs promised clean energy, rural jobs, and a better future for Bryan County. On paper, he was the respectable face of the project. He attended Chamber of Commerce breakfasts, shook hands with the mayor, donated to school fundraisers, and spoke warmly about revitalizing forgotten land. In private, he saw the county as a ledger, and people like Grace as numbers that refused to move. The solar farm proposal was real enough to fool reporters and council members, but its real purpose was access, storage, and cover. Long gravel lanes. New fencing. Private security. Warehouses no one would question because they were attached to an approved development. Preston did not like Mateo's methods, not because they were wrong, but because they were messy. "The council vote is in 3 weeks, Preston said, irritation sharpening his voice. "I need that parcel under contract before the environmental review. If Whitaker keeps holding out, questions start. If questions start, investors get nervous." Mateo gave him a look. "Your investors are nervous because they are soft. My investors are the reason your trucks have somewhere to go." The two men stared at each other for a moment, pride pressing against profit. Then Cole stepped between them just enough to remind both sides why he was there. Arguing will not get her signature. Preston exhaled through his nose. Then make her understand reality. She is a small farmer sitting on land she cannot afford to protect. Offer her more money. Mateo chuckled. You still think this is about money? Preston frowned. Everything is about money. No, Mateo said. For people like her, it becomes about pride. History. Graves in the dirt. Old family stories. They hold on because they think suffering makes ownership holy. His mouth curled with contempt. That kind of pride has to be embarrassed before it breaks. Cole looked toward the open hangar doors, where the sun was dropping behind the pines. He thought of Grace at the feed store, quiet and straight-backed, watching without seeming to watch. Something about her unsettled him too, though he would never admit it. She did not argue like other citizens. She did not plead, curse, threaten to call the news, or demand the sheriff. She just listened, and when Cole lied to her face about not having enough evidence, she looked at him as if she were filing the lie away for later. Men like Cole hated that look. It made the badge feel smaller. I can write her up for nuisance complaints, he said. Claims she has been making false reports, wasting county resources. If she pushes back, I can start building a record. Preston nodded. Good. Make her look unstable. Difficult. Angry. That helps if we need to force a civil action. Mateo shook his head. Too slow. Cole's eyes narrowed. You asked for clean. I asked for effective. Mateo walked to the map and circled the Whitaker property with a black marker. Tonight, we remind her she is alone. Nothing dramatic. Cut a fence. Leave a message. Make the boy nervous. Tomorrow, I visit with the contract again. By then, she will understand the difference between owning land and controlling it. Luis smiled, eager now. And if she still says no? Mateo capped the marker and slipped it into his pocket. Then we take something she thinks is safe. No one needed to ask what he meant. The barn sat near the center of Grace's property, old but solid, full of winter feed and family history. To Mateo, it was not a building. It was pressure. It was a message with flames. Cole should have objected. A better deputy might have. Even a smarter corrupt one might have warned them that fire drew attention. Instead, Cole imagined Grace finally standing in front of him shaken, humiliated, forced to accept his version of help. He imagined her learning that in Briar County, his report mattered more than her truth. That thought pleased him. Keep it away from the house, Cole said quietly. No injuries. I do not need that kind of heat. Mateo's smile returned. Deputy, you worry too much. But he did not say it with respect. He said it like a man reminding a paid servant to know his place. Cole heard it and swallowed his anger because the envelope in his glove compartment was thicker than usual. Outside, the first evening insects began humming in the grass. Trucks started one by one. Men checked phones, gloves, gas cans, and routes. Preston returned to his office to prepare a statement about rural development and community partnership. Cole climbed into his patrol car and rehearsed the words he would use later if anyone called about suspicious vehicles near Whitaker Farm. Mateo remained by the hangar doors, watching the road darken. He believed he knew exactly what Grace Whitaker was, an aging black farmer with too much pride, too little protection, and a piece of land powerful men had decided she did not deserve to keep. He had mistaken quiet for helpless. He had mistaken patience for surrender. And because every weak person he had crushed before had taught him the wrong lesson, Mateo Vargas was about to walk straight into the first trap he could not buy, threaten, or burn his way out of. The next morning, Mateo Vargas came to Whitaker Farm dressed like a man who expected doors to open before he touched them. His black SUV rolled through the front gate at 10 miles per hour, slow enough to be disrespectful, its tires pressing fresh tracks into the red clay Grace had smoothed flat before sunrise. A second SUV followed behind it and stopped near the old pecan tree, where two of Mateo's men stepped out and leaned against the doors as if they had been invited. Grace saw them from the barn before they reached the house. She was measuring feed into a metal trough, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her boots dusted with hay and soil. Caleb was at school. The animals were calm. The morning sun had not yet burned the cool from the air, and for one brief second, the farm looked peaceful enough to make a person believe nothing ugly could happen there. Then Mateo opened his door. He looked across the pasture at Grace and smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not even a business smile. It was the kind of smile men used when they wanted witnesses to believe they had offered kindness before turning cruel. Grace set the feed scoop down, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked toward the house with no hurry in her step. She did not call out. She did not ask what he wanted from across the yard. She let him wait on the porch while she closed the barn gate, latched it properly, and checked once that the small camera above the door still pointed toward the driveway. The red light blinked once in the shadow. Mateo did not see it. By the time Grace reached the porch, he had already placed a leather folder on her kitchen table through the open screen door, as if stepping into her home was a right instead of a violation. Grace stopped at the bottom step and looked at the folder, then at him. "You crossed my gate without permission," she said. Her voice was low, calm, and clear. Mateo gave a soft laugh. "Mrs. Whitaker, I came to help you." Help usually knocks. One of his men snickered, but Mateo's eyes sharpened. He was used to people filling silence with nervous explanations. Grace gave him none. She climbed the steps, opened the screen door wider, and walked into her kitchen without turning her back fully to any of them. The room smelled faintly of coffee, lemon soap, and cornbread cooling under a towel. Family photographs lined the wall near the pantry, Grace's parents on their wedding day, Caleb missing his two front teeth at age 7, Grace herself younger, standing beside a horse with sunlight across her face. Mateo glanced at the pictures and dismissed them almost immediately. To him, history was decoration. Land was leverage. Grace stood behind the table and tapped one finger on the leather folder. "What is this?" "A generous offer." Mateo pulled out a chair without being asked and sat down. "More generous than a property like this deserves, if we are being honest." Grace remained standing. "We are not being honest yet." That made Luis Ortega, the narrow-faced man at the door, shift his weight. Mateo's smile tightened. He opened the folder and slid a contract across the table. Vale Renewables is prepared to purchase your back acreage and the access road along the Pine Cut. You keep the farmhouse, the front pasture, and enough money to retire comfortably. No more repairing fences. No more worrying about taxes. No more pretending this place is worth the trouble it brings you. Grace looked at the contract but did not touch it. This farm is not for sale. Everything is for sale. Not everything. Mateo leaned back, studying her. He had expected anger, maybe pride, maybe the kind of trembling stubbornness he could turn into fear. Instead, she looked at him as if he were a weather pattern she had already prepared for. "You know," he said, his tone becoming softer, uglier, "most people in your position would be grateful. An older woman alone out here, struggling to keep up land that is too big for her. A smart person would take the money before the land takes everything from her." Grace folded her towel once, then set it beside the sink. A smart person would read the room before insulting the owner of the house. The air changed. Luis looked down at his boots to hide a grin. The other man near the porch stopped chewing his gum. Mateo's eyes did not leave Grace. He was not embarrassed by many things, but being corrected by a black woman in a farmhouse kitchen, in front of men who feared him, touched something petty and dangerous inside him. "Owner," he repeated slowly. That is a strong word for someone holding on by sentiment and paperwork. Grace's expression did not move. Paperwork is how ownership works in America. Paperwork can be challenged. So can trespassing. Mateo gave another quiet laugh, but it no longer sounded relaxed. You have spirit. I respect that. No, you do not. His fingers stopped on the edge of the contract. Grace looked down at his hand, then back at his face. You came here because you thought I would see 2 trucks, 3 men, and a folder, and mistake pressure for opportunity. You thought I would be polite enough to let you dress a threat like a business deal. Mateo's voice cooled. Careful, Mrs. Whitaker. I am. She said it so simply that it landed harder than if she had raised her voice. Outside, a breeze moved through the porch screen. Somewhere near the barn, a horse stamped once and settled. Grace could hear the faint hum of the SUV engine still running in her yard. She could smell cologne on Mateo, gasoline on Luis, and the bitter edge of impatience coming off men who were not used to waiting. Her right hand rested lightly on the back of a kitchen chair. Her left stayed visible at her side. Calm. Open. Controlled. Mateo mistook it for obedience because men like him needed women like Grace to be afraid in order to feel powerful. Let me explain something, he said, rising from the chair. Briar County is changing. People who understand that will benefit. People who do not will get left behind. Roads move. Tax assessments change. Wells fail inspection. Barns, old barns especially, have accidents. I would hate to see a proud family legacy become a cautionary tale. Grace let the silence stretch. Not long enough to seem unsure, only long enough to make sure every word he had spoken had room to settle. Then she said, Are you finished? Mateo blinked once. It was small, but Grace saw it. That tiny break in his rhythm. That second where a man expecting fear receives boredom instead. Excuse me. I asked if you were finished. You think this is funny? No. I think it is recorded. Luis's head lifted sharply. Mateo's gaze flicked around the kitchen, fast now, searching corners, shelves, windowsills. Grace did not smile. She looked toward the little black square above the pantry door, then back to him. It was not connected to anything important. It was an old motion sensor Caleb had bought online and never installed correctly. But Mateo did not know that. And because guilty men always know what they have said, suspicion did the work truth had not yet done. For the first time since stepping onto her property, Mateo lowered his voice. You should be very careful playing games with people you do not understand. Grace picked up the contract with 2 fingers and slid it back across the table toward him. Mr. Vargas, you are standing in my kitchen, on my land, offering me money I did not ask for and consequences I did not earn. I understand enough. His face hardened. The mask of businessmen slipped just enough for the man underneath to show through. You people always do this, he said, the words quiet but sharp. Cling to dirt like it makes you important. Act proud because somebody told you suffering was the same thing as strength. Grace's eyes changed then, not with rage, but with a stillness so complete that even Luis stopped moving. This dirt fed my family when banks would not lend to us. It buried my father with honor. It raised a boy who still believes doing right matters. So yes, I am proud of it. She stepped closer to the table, still calm, still measured. And you will not have 1 acre. Mateo stared at her, breathing through his nose. He could have walked away then. A wiser man might have. He had made the offer, delivered the warning, tested the boundary. But Grace had not bowed. She had not trembled. She had not given him the small surrender he needed to carry back to the hangar and call the meeting a success. Instead, she had made him feel watched, judged, and smaller than he had felt in years. He took the contract, slid it into the folder, and tucked it under his arm. By tomorrow, he said, you will wish you had signed. Grace opened the screen door for him. By tomorrow, you will wish you had knocked. Mateo stepped onto the porch, his men straightening as he passed. He paused at the top step and looked back once, expecting to find regret on her face. He found none. Grace stood in the doorway, framed by the dim kitchen behind her, one hand resting on the wood as steady as stone. Mateo walked to his SUV with heat rising in his chest, telling himself the anger was strategy, telling himself she was just another holdout who needed a lesson. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. Grace Whitaker had refused to make him feel powerful. And because of that, Mateo decided the next message would not come in a folder. By the time Mateo's SUV disappeared beyond the front gate, Grace already knew the visit had not ended at her kitchen table. Men like Mateo did not hear no as an answer. They heard it as a challenge to be punished. She stood on the porch until the dust settled back onto the road, then walked inside, picked up the contract he had left a faint crease in, and placed it in a plastic sleeve inside her green ledger. She wrote the date, the time, the vehicle description, and the exact words she remembered. Not every word. Only the ones that mattered. Threats. Timelines. Names. Patterns. Then she poured the coffee from her cup into the sink, washed it, dried it, and went back to work. That was what frightened men like Mateo most, though they never understood it. Grace did not perform fear for them. She did not slam doors or pace the floor or call neighbors in tears. She returned to the fence line behind the barn and replaced a rusted hinge with hands steady enough to thread a bolt on the first try. At 3:30, Caleb's school bus stopped near the mailbox, and Grace was waiting exactly where she always stood, one shoulder against the porch post, eyes on the road behind him. Caleb noticed the extra quiet before he noticed anything else. They came, did they not? He asked, stepping onto the yard with his backpack hanging low. Grace took the bag from him and nodded toward the house. Wash up. Then homework. Aunt Grace. Homework first. He stared at her, frustrated, young enough to want answers and old enough to know when she was holding them back to keep him calm. I am not a kid. Then do not make me repeat myself like one. He sighed and went inside, but Grace watched the road a few seconds longer. The first message came before sunset. A white pickup she did not recognize slowed near the north pasture, then sped away. 10 minutes later, Grace found the gate chain cut clean through, not broken by weather, not pulled by livestock, but cut with bolt cutters and dropped neatly in the dirt where she would see it. 3 calves had wandered toward the road. Grace and Caleb spent 40 minutes guiding them back while cars passed without stopping. One driver slowed, saw Grace, saw the open gate, and looked away as if concern might cost him something. Caleb's anger rose with every step. We should call the sheriff, he said. We will document it first. Document it? They cut our gate. And now we have tire tracks, tool marks, and time. That does not fix the gate. Grace looked at him then, not harshly, but firmly. Anger does not fix it either. Caleb bit back whatever he wanted to say. Together they repaired the chain with a temporary lock, and Grace made sure Caleb held the flashlight while she photographed the ground from 3 angles. She did not tell him that one of the trail cameras had caught the white pickup's rear plate when it turned around near the pines. She did not tell him she had already moved the memory card into the metal case in her coat pocket. Some truths were not ready to be shared. The second message came the next morning at Miller's Feed and Hardware. Grace had driven in to buy a new chain, 2 locks, and a spool of barbed wire. The bell over the door rang softly when she entered, and for a moment the store went too still. 3 men near the seed aisle stopped talking. Mr. Miller looked up from the register and gave her a warning with his eyes before he found the courage to speak with his mouth. Morning, Grace. Morning. She walked to the hardware wall, selected what she needed, and set everything on the counter. Before Mr. Miller could ring it up, Deputy Cole Harlan stepped from the back aisle holding a styrofoam cup of coffee he had not paid for. His uniform was crisp. His smile was lazy. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Heard there was some trouble out your way." Grace placed both hands lightly on the counter. "Then you heard correctly." Cole nodded like a man pretending to care. "Gate issue, was it? Cut chain. Tire tracks. Unknown vehicle. Could be teenagers. Teenagers with bolt cutters and a clean approach route. Kids get into things." His tone was casual, but his eyes were busy, measuring who in the store was listening. Grace understood what he was doing. Before he dismissed the crime on paper, he wanted to dismiss it in public. He wanted the town to hear him make her concerns sound small. "I would like to file a report," she said. Cole took a sip of coffee. "You can come by the office." "I am here now." "You are here now." A few people looked down. Mr. Miller suddenly became interested in the register tape. Cole's jaw moved once. "That is not how procedure works. Procedure did not stop you from taking statements at the feed store when Mr. Dawson's trailer was stolen last spring." Cole's smile thinned. "You keeping notes on me, Mrs. Whitaker?" "I keep notes on everything that concerns my property." The air tightened again, that familiar pressure that came whenever Grace stayed calm and men with smaller power felt themselves shrinking under it. Cole leaned one elbow on the counter and lowered his voice just enough to sound personal but not enough to avoid being heard. "Sometimes people make themselves targets by being difficult. You know that, right?" Grace looked at him evenly. "No one becomes responsible for another man choosing wrong. Maybe. Or maybe if you stopped stirring up problems with legitimate businesses, folks would leave you alone." There it was. Not protection. Not investigation. A warning wrapped in county authority. Grace did not blink. A legitimate business does not need strangers cutting gates in the dark. Cole's face hardened. "Careful with accusations. False reports can become a problem. So can ignoring real ones." Someone near the seed aisle coughed softly. Cole turned his head just enough to remind the room he had heard it. Then he looked back at Grace. "I am going to say this as friendly advice. Take whatever deal you have been offered. Land disputes get ugly. People get emotional. Old barns have bad wiring. Wells dry up. Animals wander. It would be a shame for a respected woman like you to make herself look unstable over a few acres of trees." Grace picked up the new chain and placed it in her cart. "I own 112 acres, deputy. I know exactly how many of them matter." His eyes narrowed. "Pride is expensive. So is corruption." The word did not rise above normal conversation, but it landed like a dropped plate. Mr. Miller froze. The men by the seed aisle stopped pretending not to listen. Cole set his coffee down with exaggerated care. For 1 second, Grace saw the man beneath the badge, offended, exposed, and eager to turn embarrassment into authority. "You have a good day, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Drive safe." "I always do." She paid for the supplies and left without hurry, feeling every eye on her back. Outside, a teenager across the street lifted his phone as if recording, then quickly lowered it when Cole stepped to the doorway. Grace noticed that too. By noon, the rumors had already started. At the diner, someone told someone else Grace was refusing a development deal that could bring jobs. At the church office, a woman whispered that maybe Grace had been acting strange lately. At the gas station, a man claimed she had accused half the county of trespassing. None of it came from nowhere. That was how Mateo worked. He did not simply threaten a person's property. He softened the ground under their reputation first. A person without credibility could shout the truth and still sound like trouble. Grace heard about the rumors from Mrs. Alma Reed, who called while Grace was repairing the north gate properly. Alma was 82, sharp as broken glass, and one of the few people in town who still said what others only thought. "Baby, they are talking, Alma said. Let them. They are saying you are holding up that solar project. Saying you are being unreasonable. I have been called worse by better people. Grace. Alma's voice softened. You need help. Grace looked across the pasture toward Caleb, who was kneeling beside the old tractor with a wrench in his hand, pretending not to watch her. Not the kind folks can give yet. Alma understood enough not to ask. Then keep your doors locked. I do. And Grace? Yes, ma'am. Do not let them make you stand alone if you do not have to. Grace did not answer right away. The wind pushed through the grass in a long green ripple. I hear you, she said. That evening, the third message came through Caleb. He had asked permission to ride his bicycle to the end of the road and back, no farther, just to clear his head. Grace said yes because boys who were always protected too tightly sometimes mistook love for a cage. But she stood near the porch with her phone in her hand and watched the road until the pine curve swallowed him. 7 minutes later, her phone rang. Caleb's voice was tight. Aunt Grace. She was already moving before he finished saying her name. Where are you? By the mailboxes. The gray SUV is here. Grace's steps did not quicken into panic. They became precise. Can you see the plate? No. They parked sideways. Are you hurt? No, put the phone in your pocket. Keep the line open. Do not argue. She climbed into the blue pickup, turned the key, and drove without speeding. Fear begged for speed. Discipline chose control. At the mailboxes, Caleb stood beside his bicycle, which lay on its side in the gravel with the front rim bent. Luis Ortega leaned against the gray SUV with 2 other men, smiling like this was a neighborhood misunderstanding. Ma'am, Luis called as Grace stepped from the truck. Your boy had a little accident. Caleb's face burned with humiliation, not injury. They swerved close. I had to jump off. Careful, Luis said, lifting both hands in false innocence. That sounds like an accusation. Grace walked to Caleb first. She checked his hands, his elbows, his face, and his breathing. Only then did she look at Luis. Move your vehicle. Luis smiled wider. Public road. You are blocking male access. Call the cops. The other men laughed. Caleb's shoulders tensed, but Grace placed 2 fingers against his wrist, a silent command to remain still. Luis noticed and mistook restraint for helplessness. You know, Mrs. Whitaker, boys need guidance. Bad things happen when they grow up thinking old women can protect them from the world. Grace's eyes held his. Do not speak to him. Or what? He took a step closer, still smiling. You going to write that in your little notebook too? Grace did not look surprised. That bothered him. Yes, she said. Luis blinked. What? I said yes. She looked toward the SUV, then at the broken bicycle wheel, then back to his face. Gray Chevrolet Tahoe. Right rear tire low by approximately 8 pounds. Scratch along the passenger door. 3 men. 1 blocking a miner's path. 1 filming from the back seat. 1 pretending not to understand this is harassment. The man in the back seat lowered his phone slightly. Luis's smile faded around the edges. You think you are smart. No, Grace said. I think you are careless. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Deputy Cole's patrol cruiser turned onto the road as if he had been waiting nearby for his entrance. He pulled in behind Grace's truck, lights off, and stepped out slowly. What is going on here? He asked, though his eyes went first to Luis, not Caleb. Caleb started to speak, but Cole lifted a hand. I asked the adults. Grace turned to him. These men blocked my nephew, damaged his bicycle, and intimidated him. Luis laughed. The kid fell. We stopped to help. Cole looked at the bent wheel. Looks like a bicycle accident to me. Caleb's voice cracked with anger. They are lying. Cole's gaze snapped toward him. Watch your tone, son. Grace stepped half an inch in front of Caleb. Not enough to challenge. Enough to shield. He is telling the truth. Cole sighed as if Grace were exhausting him. Mrs. Whitaker, this is exactly what I was talking about. You are escalating every little thing. These gentlemen say they stopped to help. You are accusing them of a crime. That is a serious pattern. Grace's face remained calm, but Caleb could feel something colder underneath it. A pattern is exactly what this is. Cole took out his notepad, more performance than procedure. Maybe I should document that you are creating disturbances with workers connected to an approved development project. They are not workers. You do not know that. Neither do you, unless you already knew who they were before you arrived. Cole's pen stopped. Luis looked away too late. Grace saw it. More importantly, the phone in Caleb's pocket heard it. Cole recovered with a hard little smile. I am going to give you a warning. Take your nephew home. Stop interfering with county progress. Stop making accusations you cannot prove. And stop acting like this town owes you special treatment because you have been sitting on that land forever. Caleb whispered, Aunt Grace, please. He wanted her to fight back. He wanted her to say what both of them knew. But Grace understood something Caleb had not learned yet. Some men were not defeated by being challenged in the road. They were defeated by being allowed to speak until they built the case against themselves. We are leaving, Grace said. Cole looked satisfied. Luis looked disappointed. Caleb looked wounded by it. Grace lifted his bicycle into the truck bed, helped him into the passenger seat, and drove back to the farm with the open phone still recording in his pocket. Only when the mailbox road disappeared behind them did Caleb speak. Why did you let them do that? His voice was quiet, and that made it hurt more than shouting would have. Let them? Grace asked. They embarrassed me. They called me a liar. He acted like I was the problem. Grace kept her eyes on the road. I know. And you just stood there. The word struck the cab and stayed there. Grace did not answer immediately. She turned into the farm, parked near the barn, and cut the engine. The evening had gone soft and gold around them, beautiful in the way the world sometimes looked right before it reminded you it was not safe. Caleb, she said, there is a difference between doing nothing and doing what they cannot see. He stared out the windshield, jaw tight. That sounds like something adults say when they are scared. Grace accepted that without flinching. Maybe. He looked at her then, surprised. Grace turned toward him. Fear is not shameful. It tells you what matters. But if you let anger drive, people like Mateo choose the road for you. Caleb's eyes dropped to his hands. Grace softened. You are not weak because you stayed quiet today. I felt weak. That is what they wanted. She reached into his jacket pocket and took out the phone, stopping the recording. Caleb watched her save the file, label it with the date and location, and send it to an address he did not recognize. Who is Naomi Brooks? He asked. Grace's thumb paused for less than a second. Someone who knows how to listen. Before he could ask more, a sharp sound cracked across the property. Not loud enough to be a gunshot, not close enough to be the house. Grace stepped out of the truck and looked toward the back pasture. One of the water pumps had burst, sending a thin white spray into the air. At the same time, the horses near the barn shifted uneasily, their heads lifting toward the pine line. Caleb climbed out behind her. What now? Grace was already walking. Near the pump house, they found the valve forced open and the pressure gauge broken. On the wooden post beside it, someone had nailed a sheet of paper inside a clear plastic bag. The message was written in thick black marker, "Sign before sunrise, or the next thing that breaks will not be replaceable." Caleb read it and went still. Grace removed the bag carefully by its edges, folded it without touching the ink, and placed it into another sleeve from her truck. The humiliation had done what Mateo intended. It had touched the gate, the town, Caleb, the water, the farm's daily order, the quiet dignity of a woman who had asked only to be left alone. But it had also done what Mateo did not understand. It had added dates, voices, faces, tire tracks, threats, and witnesses. It had turned arrogance into evidence. Grace stood beside the broken pump as the last light faded behind the barn. Caleb expected anger from her now. He almost wanted it. Instead, she looked toward the tree line, where the trail cameras waited in silence and said, "They are getting comfortable." Caleb swallowed. "Is that bad?" Grace's eyes stayed on the pines. "For them, yes." That night, long after Caleb went upstairs, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table with the green ledger open, the audio files backed up, the photographs labeled, and the old wooden box resting near her hand. She still did not open it. Not yet. Outside, somewhere beyond the north pasture, an engine idled for 3 minutes and then faded away. Grace wrote one final line beneath the day's record, "Escalation confirmed." Then she turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark, and listened to her farm breathe around her. Mateo believed he was teaching her how powerless she was. Every insult, every false report, every threat against Caleb, every careless word from Deputy Cole was meant to shrink her world until she had no choice but to surrender. But Grace had spent years learning patience from places where one rushed decision could cost everything. She knew the shape of men who thought intimidation was strategy. She knew their need to press harder when silence denied them satisfaction. And as the first thin smell of gasoline drifted on the wind from somewhere near the old barn, Grace Whitaker finally opened the wooden box. Grace opened the wooden box with the same care she used when handling anything that belonged to a life she had promised herself would stay buried. The hinges made a soft sound in the dark kitchen, barely louder than the ticking wall clock above the stove. For a moment, she did not reach inside. She only looked. The contents were arranged exactly as they had been for years, each item placed with the quiet precision of someone who understood that memory could become dangerous if left scattered. There was a faded photograph of a younger Grace standing beside 3 soldiers in desert uniforms, her face leaner than, her eyes just as still. There was a small velvet sleeve holding a coin stamped with an emblem Caleb had never seen. There was a folded paper with a number written in black ink, no name beside it, no explanation. Beneath that lay a patch with no unit markings a civilian would recognize, and an old compass scratched along the rim from a place Grace had never spoken about to anyone in Briar County. She lifted the photograph first. The young woman in it did not look like a farmer. She looked like someone who had learned to breathe slowly when the world became loud. Someone who could stand in heat, dust, and fear without letting any of it show on her face. Grace touched the edge of the picture with her thumb, then set it down and listened again toward the back pasture. The smell of gasoline was faint, carried in and out by the wind, not strong enough to prove anything by itself, but strong enough to confirm what her body already knew. They were near the barn. Not inside yet. Not committed yet. Testing. Watching. Waiting to see if she would run out with a flashlight and give them the satisfaction of panic. Grace closed her eyes once, not to pray, not exactly, but to settle the part of herself that had spent years learning to answer danger with silence. When she opened them, the old fear was there, but it was not in charge. She picked up the folded paper and dialed the number on a landline she kept for storms, power outages, and situations too important to trust to a cell tower. The call rang 3 times. On the 4th, a man answered without greeting. "This line is not for conversation." Grace looked toward the window, where the barn sat as a dark shape against the moonlit field. "Then I will keep it short." The silence on the other end changed. Not louder, not longer, just heavier. "Identify." Grace did not answer immediately. The name she needed was one she had not used in almost 20 years. Names were not just sounds. Some were keys. Some were doors. Some brought back rooms you had locked for a reason. Blackbird, she said at last. The man on the other end went quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of routine. Grace Whitaker. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Hello, Daniel. I never thought you would use this line again. Neither did I. Are you in danger? Grace looked at the green ledger on the table, the saved audio files, the photographs, the cut chain in a plastic sleeve, the note from the pump house, and the small metal case holding memory cards from cameras hidden across her own land. Not the kind that needs a team, she said. Not yet. Daniel Reeves had once been a name that opened doors behind doors. Now he was retired, like her, though Grace knew men like Daniel never fully retired from knowing things. His voice softened, but only slightly. What happened? Local pressure campaign. Land grab. Possible organized transport route. One compromised deputy. One development company as cover. One man named Mateo Vargas giving orders he thinks nobody is preserving. Daniel did not interrupt. That was why she had called him. Some people listened because they were polite. Daniel listened because he knew missing one detail could change the shape of a threat. Do you have proof? He asked. Enough to start a fire under the right desk. Not enough to finish it. Who has copies? Me. A delayed upload. And an assistant United States attorney named Naomi Brooks, if her office still uses the secure intake protocol you gave me years ago. Daniel made a sound that was almost approval. You remembered. I remember everything that keeps people alive. Outside, a light flickered beyond the barn, then vanished. Grace moved away from the window before she could be silhouetted. Her body did it before thought arrived. Old habit. Low light. Do not stand framed. Do not let a watcher know where your head is. Grace, Daniel said, hearing the change in her breathing. Talk to me. They are on the property. How many? She walked to the side window and looked through the reflection in the glass instead of directly out into the yard. At least 2 near the south side of the barn. Vehicle farther back, engine off. Wind coming out of the west. They brought fuel. They are waiting to see whether I scare easy. Do you? The question would have sounded absurd from anyone else. From Daniel, it was a measurement. Grace glanced toward the staircase where Caleb slept, or at least where she hoped he was trying to sleep. Not anymore. Then do not engage unless you have to. Preserve evidence. Protect the boy. Get federal eyes on this before the county buries it. That is why I called. Naomi Brooks is still in the Northern District, but she moved up. Public corruption and organized crime. I can send a verification tag that tells her your intake is real. Grace closed her hand around the phone cord. Do it. And Grace? Yes. If this is connected to a transport route, they will not stop at pressure. Men protecting a corridor will burn reputation first, property second, and people third. She knew that already. She had known from the moment Mateo placed his folder on her kitchen table like ownership could be rehearsed. I know the pattern. Daniel's voice lowered. I know you do. That is what worries me. Grace looked back at the wooden box. The photograph on the table seemed to watch her from another life. I am not that woman anymore. No, Daniel said. But everything she learned is still in you. After the call ended, Grace stood in the quiet kitchen with the receiver still in her hand. She wanted, for half a breath, to be only what Bryer County believed she was. A farmer. An aunt. A woman who knew soil, weather, animals, taxes, and the stubborn rituals of keeping an old place standing. She wanted the past to remain folded in wood and brass, reduced to objects Caleb might one day find and misunderstand as souvenirs. But the world had a way of testing peace by sending men who confused mercy with emptiness. Grace set the phone down and went to Caleb's room. His door was cracked open. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, shoes already on, phone in his hand, eyes wide in the blue glow. "I smelled it too," he whispered. Grace did not ask why he was awake. Fear had its own alarm clock. "Stay away from the windows." He looked past her toward the hall. "Are they going to burn it?" There was no point lying to a boy old enough to recognize gasoline on the wind. "They might." His face tightened. "We have to stop them. We have to survive them first. That barn was Grandpa's." "I know. So we just let them take it." Grace stepped into the room and lowered her voice. "Listen to me carefully. A building can be rebuilt. Evidence can put men in prison. If we run out there angry, they control what happens next. If we let them show what they are, they lose more than they came to take." Caleb shook his head, struggling between grief and disbelief. "How can you be this calm?" Grace looked at him for a long moment. The answer was too large for the room. It was sand under a foreign sky, breath held behind glass, radio silence, long waits, impossible distances, and names she still remembered on days when the farm was too quiet. It was not something a 17-year-old needed to carry. Not yet. "Because calm is a tool," she said. "And tonight we need tools." She took him downstairs to the pantry, moved 3 sacks of flour, and opened a small floor compartment he had never noticed. From inside, she removed a battery pack, 2 small cameras, a weather radio, and a second metal case. Caleb stared at the hidden space. "How long has that been there?" "Long enough." "Aunt Grace, who are you?" The question hung between them. Grace looked at the boy she had raised, the boy whose bicycle they had bent, whose pride they had tried to bruise because they could not reach hers. She wanted to tell him enough to make him feel safe without telling him so much that safety turned into fear of her. "I am the woman who promised your mother I would get you grown," she said. "Everything else comes after that." She handed him the weather radio. "Go to the center hallway. Sit on the floor away from glass. Keep this on low. If I tell you to move, you move. If I tell you to stay, you stay. No arguing. No hero work." Caleb swallowed hard. "What are you going to do?" Grace slipped one small camera into her jacket pocket and picked up the metal case. "Make sure they are seen." She moved through the farmhouse, turning off lights one by one until the house became a shape among darker shapes. Outside, the farm had changed. The night insects had gone quiet near the barn. That silence told her more than footsteps would have. Grace left through the side door, not the front, easing it closed without a click. She stayed low along the shadow of the porch, not crawling, not sneaking like a person in a movie, simply moving the way darkness allowed. Her boots knew where the boards complained and where the gravel shifted. Every step belonged to memory. At the corner of the house, she paused and watched the barn through the reflection in the rain barrel. 2 figures moved near the south wall. One carried a can. Another held a phone. They were careless, laughing softly, believing the night belonged to them because it had always protected their kind of work before. Grace set the first camera beneath the porch rail, angled toward the barn. The second she placed behind the old cultivator, where it caught the road and the shadowed shape of the vehicle waiting near the tree line. Then she took the metal case and walked back inside before either man looked toward the house. Caleb sat exactly where she had told him, knees drawn up, radio pressed between both hands. He looked smaller there, and that cut deeper than any threat Mateo had made. Grace knelt in front of him. "You are doing well." "I am scared." "Good." He blinked. "Good. Scared means you understand danger." Panic means danger is driving. You are scared, but you are listening. That is control. He nodded, trying to believe her because he needed to. From outside came the distant thump of something set against wood. Caleb flinched. Grace did not. She rose, walked to the kitchen table, and opened the metal case. Inside were memory cards, a small encrypted drive, and a sealed envelope addressed to Naomi Brooks. She added the newest card, closed the case, and placed it inside the old cast-iron flour safe built into the brick behind the stove. The safe had survived 2 hurricanes, 1 kitchen fire in 1978, and every curious child in the Whitaker family. It would survive tonight. Then Grace took the faded photograph from the table and slid it back into the wooden box. Her hand lingered over the coin. Blackbird. A name from before the farm. Before Caleb. Before she learned that peace was not the absence of threat, but the discipline to choose justice when revenge would be easier. Outside, glass broke near the barn, followed by a brief flare of light. Caleb whispered her name. Grace turned toward the window, but she did not step into view. The first glow crawled up the barn wall, small at first. Then brighter, feeding on dry wood and old hay. Her jaw tightened once. Only once. The men outside thought they were setting fire to her past. They had no idea they were illuminating their own future. Grace picked up her phone, confirmed the upload icon had turned from gray to blue, and watched the screen display one simple message from Naomi Brooks. Files received. Stay safe. Federal review initiated. For the first time that night, Grace allowed herself one quiet breath of relief. Not because the barn was safe. It was not. Not because the danger had passed. It had not. But because Mateo Vargas had crossed the line she had been waiting for him to cross, and he had done it while the cameras watched, the files moved, and the old name he never knew still carried enough weight to open the right doors. By the time the barn fire reached the roofline, the story Mateo Vargas believed he was creating had already collapsed under the weight of evidence he never knew existed. He thought the flames were destroying Grace Whitaker's courage, her leverage, and the last good reason she had to refuse his offer. But long before the first match touched dry wood, Grace had built her case the way she built fences, post by post, line by line, strong enough to hold when pressure came. The first piece had come from the trail cameras hidden along the pine cut, mounted high enough that a careless man would never look up and angled low enough to catch faces when headlights bounced off the red clay road. Those cameras had recorded the white pickup at the north gate, the gray Tahoe near the mailboxes, Luis Ortega laughing beside Caleb's broken bicycle, and Deputy Cole Harlan arriving too soon to be innocent and too calm to be surprised. The second piece had come from Caleb's phone, still recording from inside his jacket pocket when Cole dismissed him, corrected him, and warned Grace to stop interfering with county progress. The third piece had come from the kitchen, where Mateo's own voice had dressed a threat in business language while the little black sensor above the pantry door made him think he was being recorded in one place, never noticing the real recorder inside the ceramic sugar jar near the stove. Grace had not planned on needing all of it. She had hoped the early files would be enough to make federal eyes turn toward Bryan County before anyone crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But men who built their power on intimidation rarely stopped when silence denied them satisfaction. So now, while the barn burned, the proof moved through channels Mateo did not understand and could not threaten. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb sat in the center hallway with the weather radio in his lap, watching Grace work by the blue glow of her phone. He wanted to look out the window, but he obeyed her. The fire painted the walls with restless orange light, making every family photograph seem alive for a second before shadow swallowed it again. Grace stood at the kitchen table with the old flour safe open behind her, arranging the evidence in order. File names mattered. Time stamps mattered. Labels mattered. A truth poorly organized could be buried by people who made a living pretending not to see it. She named the first folder Gate Chain Cut, Vehicle Plate, North Pasture. The second, Feed Store Deputy Warning, Witnesses Present. The third, Caleb wrote harassment, Deputy Harlan response. The 4th, pump house threat note. The 5th, barn fire active, suspects on property. Each folder contained photos, audio, and short notes written in plain language, free of emotion, because emotion gave corrupt men something to attack. Facts did not. Caleb watched her hands move and realized she was not simply saving videos. She was building a road someone else could follow. Will they believe us? He asked, voice barely above the crackle outside. Grace did not look up from the screen. They will believe what can be verified. And if Deputy Cole says we made it up, then he will have to explain why his voice is on 3 recordings before anyone from dispatch was called. The words should have comforted Caleb, but they made him colder. He was beginning to understand that the danger was bigger than a few men burning a barn. It had a badge. It had a company logo. It had county meetings and polite language and people who looked away because looking directly would require courage. Grace finished compressing the files and attached them to the secure portal Naomi Brooks had sent within minutes of Daniel Reeves verifying Grace's old contact code. The message from Naomi had been brief, professional, and heavy with meaning. Mrs. Whitaker, I have received preliminary material from Mr. Reeves. Preserve your physical evidence if safe. Do not confront suspects. Mark any ongoing threat with time and location. I am initiating federal review. Grace had read it once, then moved on. Relief was useful only after the work was done. Outside, the men near the barn were no longer laughing. Fire made people careless at first, then nervous when it grew faster than they expected. One of them shouted something Grace could not make out. Another vehicle started near the tree line. Grace tapped the screen and opened the camera feed from the device beneath the porch rail. The image was grainy but clear enough. Luis stood beside the barn with his phone up, filming the flames like a trophy. Another man moved near the south wall, his face briefly lit by the fire. The waiting vehicle's passenger door opened, and for one perfect second the interior dome light revealed the driver's profile. Grace captured the frame. Mateo was not there. That meant he was careful, but not careful enough. Men like Mateo sent others to do the work, then called afterward to make sure fear had landed. Grace knew the call would come. She needed it to. She set her phone on the table, connected it to a small recording adapter Daniel had taught her to keep years ago, and waited. 2 minutes passed. 3. Caleb's breathing sounded too loud in the hallway. The barn roof groaned as part of it gave way, sending sparks into the night sky. Grace's jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed on the phone. Then it rang. Unknown number. She let it ring twice before answering. Whitaker. Mateo's voice came through warm and smooth, as if he were calling about weather. Mrs. Whitaker. I hope I did not wake you. Grace pressed the record icon. You did not. Good. I was thinking about our conversation. Pride can make people ignore reasonable offers. Is that why your men are on my property? A pause. Small, but there. That is a serious accusation. So is arson. Mateo laughed softly. Old barns burn all the time. Bad wiring. Dry hay. Neglect. You should have taken better care of your family legacy. Caleb looked up sharply from the hallway. Grace lifted one finger, and he stayed silent. You sound certain of the cause before anyone has investigated. I understand patterns. So do I. Mateo's voice lost a little softness. Then understand this pattern. You had a chance to sign with dignity. Tomorrow morning, Deputy Harlan will come by. He will find a tragic farm accident, maybe connected to your own carelessness, maybe connected to financial stress. People will talk. Insurance will ask questions. And that development offer you were too proud to accept will start looking merciful. Grace let him talk. Every second was another nail he hammered into his own case. You forgot one thing, she said. Did I? You keep assuming I am alone. This time Mateo did not laugh right away. Look around, Mrs. Whitaker. Who is standing with you? Grace looked toward the hallway, toward Caleb, toward the flower safe, toward the old wooden box still open on the table. Then she looked out at the orange glow beyond the window, where Luis and the others were still moving under the eyes of cameras they had never bothered to find. Enough people, she said. And enough proof. The line went quiet except for the faint sound of Mateo breathing. When he spoke again, the charm was gone. Be careful with that word. Proof. You do not want to become the kind of woman who invents stories because she cannot accept progress. And you do not want to become the kind of man who explains a recorded threat to a federal prosecutor. Another pause. This one longer. Caleb stared at Grace as if seeing a door open in a wall he had thought was solid. Mateo's voice returned lower, controlled but edged. You are bluffing. Grace said nothing. His anger rushed to fill the silence. Whatever you think you have, it will not matter. I have seen people like you before. You hold on to old dirt, old pain, old names, and think it makes you untouchable. It does not. By sunrise, you will sign, or you will lose more than a barn. Grace ended the call before he could take the last word. Not because she was afraid, but because she had what she needed. The file saved automatically. The upload began before the screen dimmed. In the hallway, Caleb whispered, he said it. He basically admitted it. Grace removed the adapter and placed the phone beside the metal case. He admitted enough to ask better questions. Why does that not sound like enough? Because courtrooms are not built on what we know. They are built on what we can prove. She walked to the back pantry, lifted a jar of peach preserves from the lowest shelf, and removed a thumb drive taped beneath it. Caleb blinked. There is more. There has to be. On that drive were copies of property records, tax receipts, the original deed from 1949, and a scanned letter from Vail Renewables offering far below market value for access to a specific strip of land the public development plans claimed they did not need. There were also photographs Grace had taken over 6 weeks, tire tracks at midnight, trucks entering the old crop dusting airstrip, Deputy Cole's cruiser parked behind the hangar, and Preston Vail leaving the same property through a side road while telling the town council he had no private contact with Vargas. None of those things alone proved the whole machine. Together, they made the machine visible. Grace attached the new call recording to the file packet and sent the updated folder to Naomi. This time the reply came faster. Received. Federal agents are being notified. Stay inside if possible. Local response may be compromised. Grace read the last line twice. Local response may be compromised. It was one thing to know it. It was another to see it confirmed by someone with a federal title. Caleb stood now, still holding the radio. So what happens next? Before Grace could answer, red and blue lights flashed faintly through the kitchen curtains. Not near the barn. Near the front gate. Caleb's face changed. That was fast. Grace moved to the side window and looked through the reflection again. Deputy Cole's patrol cruiser rolled up the driveway without siren, slow and theatrical, as if arriving for a scene he had rehearsed. He parked too close to the house, stepped out, and adjusted his belt while the barn still burned behind him. No fire truck followed. No ambulance. No second patrol car. Just Cole, his flashlight, and the expression of a man prepared to write the truth out of existence. Grace picked up her phone and started a new recording before opening the door. She did not step onto the porch. She stood inside the threshold where the porch camera caught both her face and his. Caleb stayed out of sight in the hallway, the way she had told him. Cole shined his flashlight toward her even though the porch light was on. Mrs. Whitaker, he called. We got a report of a structure fire. From whom? Cole lowered the light an inch. Excuse me, Who reported it? Dispatch did. And who called dispatch? His mouth tightened. That is not important right now. A barn is burning on my property. It is important to me. Cole glanced toward the flames with the lazy impatience of a man looking at paperwork, not danger. Looks like you have had some trouble maintaining the place. You have not inspected it. I have seen enough old barns. Have you called the fire department? They are on the way. Grace knew that was false because Caleb had the emergency scanner on low volume, and there had been no fire dispatch for Whitaker Farm. Cole stepped closer to the porch. I need you to come outside and answer some questions. I can answer from here. Do not make this difficult. The fire is behind the house. The suspects left toward the Pine Road. Your cruiser is blocking my driveway. The fire department has not been called. Which part should I make easier for you? Cole's face hardened in the porch light. There it was again, the bruised pride of a small man whose authority did not land where he expected. You know, Mrs. Whitaker, people in town are concerned about you. Saying you have been agitated lately. Making accusations. Seeing threats everywhere. Now your barn catches fire right after a major purchase offer you rejected. That is going to raise questions. Grace held the phone at her side, microphone exposed. Are you suggesting I burn my own barn? Cole looked straight at her. I am saying desperate people do desperate things. Behind him, the porch camera blinked red from the beam above the door. Cole did not notice. He was too busy performing power. Deputy, Grace said, you are standing here accusing me while the people who did this are leaving the property. You do not know that. I have video. His expression shifted before he could stop it. Video of what? Enough. Cole stepped onto the first porch stair. Hand it over. No, the word was quiet, clean, and final. Cole's eyes narrowed. Evidence in an active investigation belongs with law enforcement. Then I will give it to law enforcement. That is me. Not tonight. For the first time, Cole looked past her into the dark hallway, trying to see if anyone else was there. Grace shifted 1 inch, blocking his view without seeming to. You are making a mistake, he said. No, Grace replied. You are making a record. Cole stared at her, confused by the phrase, then finally noticed the small camera above the porch beam. His eyes snapped to it. Then to the phone in her hand. Then back to her face. The anger came quickly, but so did fear. Not enough to stop him forever. Enough to make him step back. This is not over, he said. Grace looked beyond him, where the barn glowed red against the night and the last of Mateo's men vanished into the tree line, their path saved on 2 cameras and already moving through a federal server. No, she said. It is finally starting. Cole left without filing a report, without calling the fire department, and without realizing that his refusal to help had just become part of the case. 10 minutes later, the real emergency call went out through a neighboring county, placed by Naomi Brooks after receiving Grace's live update and confirming Bryan County Dispatch had no active fire response logged. By then, the barn was beyond saving, but the evidence was not. Grace and Caleb stood in the hallway as distant sirens finally rose from the south, not from town but from the next county over. Caleb looked at the orange light fading into smoke and wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Grace put one hand on his shoulder. She did not tell him not to cry. Some losses deserve tears. But beneath the grief, something else had taken shape. The cartel had been seen. The deputy had been heard. The false narrative had been recorded before it could harden. The land records, threats, videos, calls, and witness timelines were no longer hidden in a farmhouse kitchen. They were in the hands of someone Mateo could not intimidate with an envelope, a badge, or a burning barn. And as the first fire engine from the neighboring county turned through the gate, Grace Whitaker looked at the smoke rising over her family's land and understood exactly what Mateo did not. He thought evidence was something you destroyed after the crime. He did not realize Grace had made the crime create the evidence for her. By dawn, the fire trucks from the neighboring county had soaked the last glowing beams of the barn until the structure stood like a blackened skeleton against the gray morning, but Mateo Vargas did not wait for smoke to clear before making his next move. He had expected ashes to make Grace Whitaker smaller. He had expected confusion, grief, rumors, and Deputy Cole's false report to push her toward the contract. Instead, before 8 o'clock, word reached him that the fire department had come from outside Bryan County, that federal intake had been contacted, and that Grace had refused to hand her evidence to Cole. By 9, Preston Vale was calling every 10 minutes, demanding to know why an old farmer had suddenly become a legal problem. By 10, Cole was parked behind the abandoned airstrip with his sunglasses on and his temper barely hidden, telling Mateo that Grace had cameras, recordings, and some kind of outside contact. Mateo listened without interrupting, but the longer Cole talked, the colder his face became. The problem, he realized, was not that Grace had resisted. Resistance could be broken. The problem was that she had resisted correctly. She had not attacked his men. She had not made wild accusations in public. She had not let Cole bait her into looking unstable. She had collected, labeled, and sent proof to someone beyond their reach. That meant the old methods were not enough anymore. Fear had to become personal. By late afternoon, while Grace was at the county fire office giving a statement to an investigator from the neighboring jurisdiction, Mateo's men watched Caleb leave school. He did not take the bus that day. Grace had arranged for Mrs. Alma Reed's grandson to drive him straight home, but teenagers were not made to live under siege, and Caleb had asked to stop for 10 minutes at Miller's feed to buy a replacement part for the tractor he still believed he could repair. He wanted one ordinary errand, one small proof that Mateo had not taken every piece of normal life from him. That was all it took. The gray Tahoe appeared behind the store as Caleb stepped out with a paper bag in one hand and his phone in the other. Luis Ortega called his name like they were old friends. Caleb froze, then started walking faster toward the truck parked near the curb. A second man stepped from between two parked vehicles, not touching him at first, only blocking the path with a smile that made every word feel like a hand on his shoulder. "Your aunt has something that belongs to Mr. Vargas," Luis said. Caleb tried to step around him. "I do not know what you are talking about." "That is sad," Luis answered. "Because now you have to help us ask." Across the street, Mr. Miller saw enough through the front window to know something was wrong, but by the time he reached the door, the Tahoe was already pulling away. Caleb's phone lay face down near the curb, still connected to Grace's last text message, the screen cracked but glowing. Nobody in the store moved for 3 full seconds. Then Mr. Miller ran outside, picked it up with shaking hands, and called Grace before he called anyone else, because at that point, even he understood the sheriff's office could not be trusted. Grace answered on the second ring from the hallway of the fire office. "Caleb." "Grace, it is Tom Miller. Listen to me. The boy is gone." The world did not tilt. It narrowed. Grace's eyes moved once to the investigator standing beside the desk, then to the exit, then to the reflection in the window behind him. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Mr. Miller's voice trembled as he described the Tahoe. Luis, the second man, the direction they took, and the phone on the curb. Grace did not cry out. She did not ask the same question twice. She repeated the vehicle description, confirmed the direction, and told him to save the security footage without copying it to anyone from Bryan County. When she ended the call, the investigator asked if she needed to sit down. Grace was already walking. "No," she said. "I need your office to preserve every word I am about to say." At 5:21 in the evening, Grace's own phone rang from an unknown number. She was back at the farmhouse by then, standing in the center of the kitchen with the curtains drawn and the porch cameras recording. Naomi Brooks was on a secure line through Grace's laptop, silent but listening. Daniel Reeves had sent one more message: federal movement approved. Keep them talking if safe. The unknown number rang again. Grace touched the recorder, answered, and said nothing. For a moment there was only road noise, then Caleb's voice came through, strained but clear. "Aunt Grace." Grace closed her eyes once. When she opened them, everything inside her had gone still. "I am here. I am okay." The words came too fast, the way people speak when they have been told what to say. Mateo's voice replaced his. "He is okay because I am still in a patient mood." Grace looked at the small camera on the kitchen shelf and spoke evenly. "Put him somewhere safe and leave him there. This is your final chance to stop making it worse." Mateo laughed softly. "Final chance? Mrs. Whitaker, your barn is ash, your local deputy thinks you are unstable, and your boy is sitting in a place you will not find unless I invite you. You are not in a position to offer chances. Where is he? Where you will come alone." "No," the words seemed to surprise him. "No. I will not trade a child in the dark with men who lie for a living." Mateo's voice hardened. "Then listen carefully. The proof you sent out, the original files, the drive, the documents, whatever you think makes you powerful, you will bring it to the burned barn before midnight. No federal people. No neighboring county. No old friends. Just you and the evidence. If I see anyone else, the boy leaves Briar County in a truck with no windows." Naomi's face on the laptop screen changed, but she did not speak. Grace's eyes stayed on the phone. "Let me speak to him again. You do not give orders. Let me hear him, or this conversation ends." A long pause followed. Mateo wanted control, but he wanted the exchange more. Caleb came back on the line. "Aunt Grace. Listen to me. Count what you hear." Caleb breathed shakily, then answered with the faintest thread of understanding. "A train horn. Far off. A fan. Metal door. Smells like oil." Grace's mind moved through the county map faster than fear could follow. Train horn to the east. Industrial fan. Oil. Metal door. Not the airstrip hangar, too far from the rail line. Not Preston's office. The old cotton gin warehouse near Route 27. Closed for years. Bought last winter by a company tied to Vail Renewables. "Good," she said. "Keep breathing." Mateo grabbed the call back. "Enough. Midnight." "Mateo," Grace said, and for the first time she used his name not as a courtesy, but as a warning. "You still have time to return him and face what you have already done without adding a child to the case." His laugh came back, sharper now. "There she is. The proud old woman giving lessons while standing in ashes. This is not pride. Then what is it?" Grace looked at the wooden box on the table, the old photograph beside it, the encoded files already mirrored beyond his reach, and the empty chair where Caleb should have been complaining about dinner. Restraint. Mateo did not understand the word the way she meant it. He mistook it for weakness again. "Bring the proof." The call ended. For 3 seconds, the kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the laptop. Then Naomi Brooks spoke, controlled but urgent. "Mrs. Whitaker, do not go alone." Grace shut her eyes briefly, then opened them. "He told me to come alone because he thinks alone means unsupported. We can have federal agents staged outside the county line, but we need time and probable location confirmation. Old cotton gin off Route 27. Naomi leaned forward. "How certain?" "Certain enough to save a boy. Not enough to put in a warrant without more. Then we get more. Can you keep him engaged?" Grace looked toward the darkening yard. The barn ruins sat black against the last light, exactly where Mateo had demanded the exchange. "Yes. At 9:45, Deputy Cole arrived at the farmhouse with 2 patrol cars behind him and a folded document in his hand. This time he did not bother with a lazy smile. He marched to the porch while the younger deputies hung back, uncertain and nervous. Their body cameras blinked red against their uniforms, a detail Cole seemed too angry to remember. Grace opened the door before he knocked. "Deputy." Cole held up the paper. "We have received a credible report that you may be withholding evidence in an active investigation and making false claims about a missing minor. My nephew was taken." "According to who?" "Tom Miller." "He is confused. The school says Caleb left voluntarily with someone known to him." "That is false. You keep saying that word." Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice though the body cameras remained live. "False report. False accusation. False story. You see a pattern?" Grace's gaze dropped briefly to the red light on his chest, then returned to his face. "I do." He misread her again. "I have authority to enter and secure any materials related to the fire investigation." "No, you do not. Do not test me. Show me a warrant signed by a judge." Cole's nostrils flared. One of the younger deputies shifted behind him, suddenly interested in the paper in Cole's hand, which was not a warrant and did not pretend well under porch light. Cole folded it tighter. "You want to play legal games while your own nephew is supposedly missing? I want you to say on camera that you are refusing to search for him." The younger deputies looked at each other. Cole realized too late what she had done. His body camera. Their body cameras. Her porch camera. The old woman he thought he could corner had turned his arrival into another record. "Turn those off," he snapped at the deputies. Neither moved immediately. "Now." One reached toward his chest, but Grace spoke before he touched the button. "Deputy, if you shut off body cameras during a missing child report after threatening to enter without a warrant, that choice will be reviewed." The young deputy's hand stopped. Cole turned red with anger. "You think you are smarter than everybody in this county?" Grace's voice stayed calm. "No. I think some people here have counted on nobody checking." Cole stepped close enough that his shadow crossed the threshold. "You listen to me. Whatever you think you sent, whatever little files you have, none of it changes how things work here. By morning, the story will be simple. You were under stress. You burned your own barn. Your nephew ran off because he was scared of you. And all this nonsense about Vargas will look like the ramblings of a woman who could not handle losing her land." One of the young deputies looked visibly uncomfortable now. Grace did not look at him. She kept Cole talking. "Is that your official statement?" Cole seemed to hear himself then, but pride would not let him retreat. "It is a warning." "Warnings are useful," Grace said. "They show intent." His eyes flicked up to the porch camera, then back to her. "You are going to regret this. I regret letting you wear that badge this long." The words were not loud, but they landed. Cole stepped back as if he had been struck by the truth of them, then pointed toward the driveway. "We will be back. Bring a warrant. And bring deputies willing to keep their cameras on." He left furious, tires spitting gravel as his cruiser pulled away. But he had given Grace exactly what she needed, confirmation that local law enforcement was actively constructing a false narrative before any proper investigation, on camera, in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend they had not heard it. At 11:38, Grace stood at the edge of the burned barn with an old canvas field bag in her left hand and a phone in her coat pocket transmitting live audio to Naomi. The ruins smelled of wet ash and smoke. The moon hung behind clouds, turning the pasture silver in broken pieces. Across the field, headlights appeared one by one. 3 SUVs. Then a fourth. Mateo had not come alone, which meant he had never intended a simple trade. Grace had expected that. Luis opened the rear door of the second vehicle, and Caleb stepped out with his hands bound in front of him, frightened but upright. Grace's face did not change, but something ancient and controlled moved behind her eyes. Mateo walked forward, smiling as if he had won. "You came." Grace looked at Caleb first. "Are you hurt?" Caleb shook his head quickly. "No." Mateo spread his hands. "See? I kept my word. You burned my barn, threatened my family, corrupted a deputy, and took a child to force silence. Do not dress that up as honor." His smile faded. "The proof." Grace held up the canvas bag. "Let him walk to the porch first." Mateo laughed, and his men laughed with him because they thought laughter made them safe. "Still making demands." "That was not a demand. That was the last reasonable option you are going to hear tonight." Luis stepped closer to Caleb, and Grace's eyes moved to him with such precision that he stopped without understanding why. Mateo noticed. For a brief second, his confidence faltered, not because he knew who Grace was, but because a man used to fear had just seen something colder than fear looking back at him. He recovered by becoming cruel. "You know what your problem is, Mrs. Whitaker. You think dignity protects you. It does not. You are just an old woman standing in a burned field with a bag full of papers. People like you always believe the truth will save you." Grace's hand tightened once on the canvas strap. "No," she said. "I believe the truth needs witnesses." Mateo looked around at his men, then at the empty field, then smiled again. "Then it is a shame nobody important is here." Grace looked past him toward the tree line, where darkness hid more than he knew. She had warned him. She had given him chance after chance to step back before he made the one choice no apology could soften. But by bringing Caleb here, by using a child as leverage, by trying to bury truth under ash and lies, Mateo had crossed from intimidation into something the law could not ignore and Grace would never forgive. The night seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stared at her, scared but trusting. Mateo reached for the bag, certain the old farmer had finally broken. Grace did not move. Her silence was not surrender. It was the final second before the trap closed. Mateo's hand remained extended toward the canvas bag, his confidence still hanging in the smoky air like he owned the night, but Grace did not give it to him. She stood in the ash field with the burned barn behind her, Caleb 20 feet away beside Luis, and 4 SUVs arranged in a loose half-circle that Mateo believed gave him control. The headlights cut across the pasture in hard white bands, turning the wet ash silver and throwing long shadows behind every man who had come to watch an old woman surrender. Mateo tilted his head, amused at first. "Do not make this dramatic, Mrs. Whitaker. You lost. Hand it over." Grace looked at his open palm, then at his face. "You still think this is about what is in the bag?" His smile thinned. "It is." "No," she said. "That is what you were told to look at." A small silence followed, not fear yet, only confusion. Mateo glanced at Luis, then back at Grace. "Open it." Grace set the canvas bag carefully on the hood of a burned-out tractor near the barn ruins. She unzipped it slowly. Inside were papers, 2 labeled drives, and a black folder tied with string. Mateo's eyes followed every movement. He believed he was watching his victory being unpacked. But Caleb saw something else. He saw that Grace's hands were not shaking. He saw her eyes move once toward the tree line, once toward the old water tower, once toward the broken roof beam behind Mateo. She was not looking for escape. She was confirming positions. "Before I give you anything," Grace said, "I want you to understand what you have done." Mateo laughed under his breath. "I understand exactly what I have done. I made a stubborn woman face reality. You sent men onto my property on Monday at 6:14 in the evening in a white Ford pickup with a cracked passenger mirror. They cut my north gate chain with 24-inch bolt cutters and drove out through the Pine Road. On Tuesday, Deputy Cole Harlan stood inside Miller's Feed and Hardware and warned me in front of 4 witnesses to stop interfering with county progress. At 4:17 that afternoon, Luis Ortega blocked my nephew at the mailboxes in a gray Chevrolet Tahoe with low pressure in the rear right tire. At 7:52 that night, your men forced the pump valve open, broke the gauge, and left a written threat at the post. Luis's face changed first. Not much, just a tightening around the mouth. Mateo's fingers curled slightly. You have a good memory. I have more than memory. Grace reached into the folder and removed a single photograph. She held it up, not close enough for him to grab, just close enough for the headlights to catch the image. Luis beside Caleb's bicycle. His face clear. The Tahoe plate visible in the corner. One of Mateo's men shifted his weight. Grace placed the photo on the tractor hood and removed another. Deputy Cole behind the airstrip hangar. Then another. Preston Vale leaving the same property through the side road. Then a fourth. The barn wall before the fire, 2 figures beside it, one holding a fuel can, one holding a phone. Mateo's expression did not break, but his eyes began moving faster. Pictures can be misunderstood, he said. Yes, Grace answered. That is why I kept the audio. She touched the screen of the phone in her coat pocket. Mateo's own voice came out into the night, clear enough that every man heard it. Old barns burn all the time. Bad wiring. Dry hay. Neglect. You should have taken better care of your family legacy. Nobody moved. The recording continued for 3 more seconds before Grace stopped it. The field seemed colder after the voice disappeared. Mateo's men looked at him now, not as a leader, but as a man whose certainty had started to leak. Mateo forced a smile. You recorded a phone call. That does not make you powerful. No, Grace said. It makes you careless. His jaw tightened. Enough. Not yet. Her voice did not rise. That was what made the next words feel heavier. Deputy Cole arrived after the fire and accused me of burning my own barn before calling for emergency response. He did that on my porch camera, his own body camera, and 2 deputy body cameras he ordered turned off after he had already said too much. Mr. Miller has store footage of Luis taking Caleb. The neighboring county fire investigator has the first scene report. Naomi Brooks has every digital copy. Daniel Reeves has verified the chain of custody. Mateo's smile was gone now. Who is Naomi Brooks? Grace let the name settle before answering. Assistant United States Attorney Naomi Brooks. Public corruption and organized crime. One of the men near the 3rd SUV muttered something under his breath. Mateo snapped his eyes toward him, and the man went quiet. But the shift had already happened. The crowd that had arrived to witness Grace's surrender was now listening to the shape of a federal case. Mateo stepped closer, anger trying to cover calculation. You are bluffing. If federal people were involved, they would be here. Grace looked at him for a long second. They are. The first sign was not a siren. It was a red dot of light blinking high on the old water tower, where no farm equipment belonged. Then came the faint hum overhead, low and steady. A small drone moved out from behind the cloud line, its light barely visible above the pasture. Mateo looked up, and for the first time that night, his face truly changed. Not panic yet. Recognition. He turned toward the tree line. In the darkness beyond the headlights, shapes moved where he had seen only pine trunks. Vehicles without headlights lined the back road. Doors opened softly. Radios clicked. The men beside the SUVs straightened, their confidence breaking into uncertainty. Luis took 1 step away from Caleb. Grace's eyes cut to him. Do not. He stopped. The command was quiet, but it landed like steel. Mateo stared at her then, really stared, as if seeing beyond the head scarf, the muddy boots, the lined face, the old denim jacket. He saw the way she had placed herself in the only angle where none of his vehicles could block the view from the tree line. He saw that she had kept him talking with his back to the widest open ground. He saw that she had counted his men, their spacing, their exits, and the time it would take each driver to reach a door. He saw that the old woman he had mocked had not walked into his trap. She had allowed him to walk into hers. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question came out lower than he intended. Grace did not answer. Her phone did. A woman's voice came through the speaker, professional and unmistakably calm. "This is Assistant United States Attorney Naomi Brooks. Mr. Vargas, this conversation and the events occurring at Whitaker Farm are being monitored by federal law enforcement. Release Caleb Whitaker and instruct your men to step away from the vehicles." Mateo's lips parted slightly. For once, he had no prepared line. Then another voice came through, older, male, carrying authority from a world Mateo had never entered. "Grace, federal units are in position. Hold where you are." Daniel Reeves paused, then spoke the name Mateo would not understand until someone explained it to him later. "Blackbird, you are clear." The word struck the field differently. Caleb looked at Grace. Luis looked at her. Even Mateo, who had no history with that name, felt the men behind him respond to the tone. Blackbird was not a nickname from town. It was not a farmer's joke. It was a call sign that had survived rooms with no windows, missions with no headlines, and people who knew better than to use it casually. Grace reached into the canvas bag one last time and removed the faded photograph from the wooden box. She held it where Mateo could see the younger version of her in uniform, standing beneath a desert sky beside men whose faces had been partly marked out. Her own face was untouched. Same eyes. Same stillness. "Retired Sergeant Major Grace Whitaker," Daniel's voice said through the phone. "Former long-range specialist attached to a classified Delta operations unit. Verified identity. Verified service record. Verified contact authorization." The field went silent in a way fire had never made it. Mateo looked from the photograph to Grace's face, and the last of his arrogance slipped. He finally understood what his men had been too foolish to see, what Cole had been too small to imagine, what Preston Vale had never included in a risk assessment. Grace Whitaker had not been calm because she lacked power. She had been calm because power without control was exactly how men like Mateo destroyed themselves. Grace put the photograph back into the folder and zipped the canvas bag. "You thought I was protecting a barn," she said. "I was protecting the case." Mateo's eyes darted toward the SUVs, but the exits were already gone. Red and blue lights came alive beyond the trees, not from Bryan County cruisers, but from federal vehicles and neighboring county units. Agents moved into the headlight glow with clear commands, controlled and coordinated. No chaos. No shouting from Grace. No revenge speech. Just authority arriving where false authority had been standing. Caleb was guided away from Luis and ran to Grace. She caught him with one arm and kept her eyes forward, still watching, still measuring, still refusing to let relief make her careless. Mateo stood frozen as the knight he believed he owned changed hands around him. The badge he had bought was not here to protect him. The fear he had spent years planting did not grow in this soil anymore. And the black farmer he had tried to erase from her own land was the one person in the field who had known from the beginning exactly how this would end. Federal agents entered the pasture in a steady line, their commands clear, their hands visible, their movements controlled in a way that made Mateo's men look suddenly small and disorganized beneath the harsh white headlights. Nobody had to guess who held power anymore. The old half-circle of SUVs that Mateo had arranged to trap Grace now became the thing that trapped him, boxed in by federal vehicles at the tree line and neighboring county units at the road. Luis Ortega was the first to break. He raised his hands before anyone reached him, his face pale under the flashing lights, and tried to speak over everyone at once. "I was just driving. I did not touch the kid. I was told to bring him here. An agent guided him away from Caleb and secured him beside the second SUV while another photographed the vehicle, the cracked phone found on the floorboard, the coil of rope in the cargo area, and the fuel residue on the rubber mat. Each item was tagged. Each word was recorded. Every careless choice Luis had made became one more piece of the case he had thought fear would erase. Mateo tried to recover his old voice, the polished one he used with councilmen and frightened landowners. There has been a misunderstanding, he said, lifting his hands only halfway. This woman has been unstable for days. She burned her own barn and created a story because she did not want to sell. Agent Marlene Price, the federal case lead on scene, looked at him without expression. Mr. Vargas, you are being detained pending charges related to kidnapping, extortion, witness intimidation, conspiracy, arson, and obstruction. The words hit the field harder than any shout could have. Mateo looked toward Grace, expecting triumph on her face, maybe hatred, something he could call personal and use against her later. He found neither. Grace stood with one arm around Caleb, watching like a woman who had waited a long time for the truth to become official. You cannot prove any of that, Mateo said. Agent Price held up a tablet. On the screen was the camera feed from Grace's porch, the phone recording of Mateo's call, the trail camera footage of Luis near the barn, and the live audio from the field. The evidence was transmitted, preserved, time-stamped, and verified before we arrived. Additional warrants are being executed as we speak. Mateo's eyes shifted. That was the moment Grace knew he understood the payoff would not end in her pasture. It had already spread beyond him. At the old cotton gin warehouse near Route 27, federal agents found the chair where Caleb had been held, the zip ties Luis had handled, the oil-stained floor he had described, and security footage from a neighboring business that caught the gray Tahoe entering 2 hours earlier. At the abandoned airstrip, another team entered the hangar with a warrant signed by a federal judge after Naomi Brooks matched Grace's evidence with Daniel Reeves's verification tag and the recorded threats from Deputy Cole. They found shipping manifests hidden behind false invoices, burner phones in a locked cabinet, cash envelopes labeled only by initials, and a folder with maps of rural properties targeted for acquisition. One map had Whitaker Farms circled in black marker. Beside it were the names of 7 other families who had sold under pressure. At Preston Vale's downtown office, agents arrived while he was shredding documents under the glow of a desk lamp, still wearing the same loosened tie from the airstrip meeting. He tried to claim everything was a misunderstanding connected to legitimate land development. Then an agent placed printed photographs from Grace's files on his desk, Preston leaving the hangar, Deputy Cole's cruiser behind the building, the Vale Renewables offer that contradicted the public development plans, and a payment ledger showing consulting fees to a shell company tied to Cole. Preston stopped speaking after that. His company's pending county contract was frozen before morning, his accounts were flagged, and the solar development proposal that had once sounded like progress became the center of a public corruption investigation. Deputy Cole Harlan lasted longer, but only because corrupt men often confuse delay with escape. At 2:17 in the morning, he was called to the sheriff's office under the pretense of an internal briefing. He arrived angry, already rehearsing a complaint against Grace for interfering with an investigation. Instead, he found the sheriff, 2 state investigators, and Agent Price waiting in a conference room with his own body camera footage paused on a screen behind them. The image showed him on Grace's porch, accusing her without cause, threatening to enter without a warrant, and telling deputies to turn off their cameras during a missing child report. On the table were copies of the cash envelopes recovered from the hangar, photos of his cruiser behind the airstrip, and audio from Miller's feed where he warned Grace to accept the deal. Cole looked at the screen, then at the envelope with his initials, and for the first time in his career, the badge on his chest did not make the room smaller for anyone else. It made him look smaller. The sheriff removed Cole's service weapon and badge in front of the state investigators. Cole protested, demanded a union representative, claimed political bias, claimed Grace had manipulated him, claimed everyone was taking the word of a bitter woman over a decorated deputy. But the evidence did not care what he called her. The evidence had his voice. His timing. His lies. His order to shut off cameras. His pattern of closing reports on properties Mateo wanted. By sunrise, Cole was suspended without pay, formally charged with obstruction, official misconduct, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. When they placed him in handcuffs, he stared at the table instead of the people in the room, unable to look at the badge he had lost. Back at Whitaker Farm, the scene lasted until the eastern sky turned pale. Agents photographed the barn ruins, collected residue samples, marked footprints near the south wall, and removed the blackened remains of the fuel container hidden beneath collapsed boards. Grace handed over the physical evidence in order: the green ledger, the plastic sleeves, the memory cards, the thumb drive, the property records, and the original deed from 1949. She did not hand them to Deputy Cole. She handed them to Naomi Brooks, who arrived just after dawn in a navy coat with her hair pulled back and a federal identification card clipped to her lapel. Naomi accepted the materials with both hands, not casually, not like paperwork, but like someone receiving something a family had suffered to preserve. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "your documentation prevented them from burying this." Grace looked toward the barn, where steam still rose from the soaked beams. "They buried enough before me." Naomi nodded. "Then we start digging." Within 48 hours, the charges expanded. Mateo Vargas was indicted for leading an interstate criminal enterprise that used intimidation, fraud, and corrupt local protection to seize rural land and move contraband through private routes. Luis Ortega and the other men from the pasture were charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, arson, and witness intimidation. Several accepted cooperation agreements after seeing the evidence stacked against them. They gave names, routes, bank drops, and confirmation that Mateo had ordered the barn burned specifically to force Grace to surrender the land and silence her about the transport corridor. Preston Vale was removed as chief executive of Vale Renewables by emergency board action. His company's county bids were suspended, and federal prosecutors filed to seize assets linked to the laundering scheme. Every contract connected to the project went under review. Families who had been pressured to sell received notice that their cases would be reopened. Broward County's sheriff's office was placed under outside supervision while state investigators reviewed years of reports Cole had dismissed as accidents, disputes, or false complaints. The payoff reached the town slowly at first, then all at once. The diner went quiet when the local news played footage of Cole being escorted from the sheriff's office without his badge. At Miller's Feed, the men who had looked away from Grace during the first warning watched themselves on security video standing frozen while Cole tried to make her seem unstable. Mr. Miller gave a formal statement and turned over every camera angle from the day Caleb was taken. Mrs. Alma Reed told investigators about the calls from other farmers, the sudden sales, the threats people were too scared to put in writing. One by one, silence began to break, not because people had suddenly become brave, but because Grace's evidence had made bravery feel possible. Caleb was cleared of every false claim before those claims could take root. The school confirmed he had not left voluntarily with anyone authorized. Miller's footage proved the abduction. The old cotton gin evidence matched Caleb's description. Naomi made sure the public statement named him correctly: a victim, a witness, and a minor whose safety had been used as leverage by criminals and corrupt officials. Grace was cleared of all suspicion in the barn fire after investigators confirmed the burn pattern, residue samples, camera footage, and Mateo's recorded call. Her insurance claim was protected from the false narrative Cole had tried to create, and the county issued a formal correction withdrawing every suggestion that she had caused the fire herself. That mattered more than outsiders understood. Grace had not just lost a barn. She had almost been robbed of her name. The law gave that back. Still, when Agent Price asked Grace if she wanted to make a victim impact statement at Mateo's detention hearing, Grace did not write a speech full of anger. She stood in the federal courtroom 3 days later wearing a dark dress, her hands folded in front of her, Caleb seated behind her with Naomi nearby. Mateo sat at the defense table in a county jumpsuit, no watch, no polished boots, no men behind him laughing at his cruelty. Deputy Cole sat in a different row for a separate hearing, stripped of uniform, face pale under fluorescent lights. Preston Vale avoided looking anywhere but the floor. Grace looked at the judge and spoke clearly. They thought burning my barn would make me desperate enough to sign away my family's land. They thought taking my nephew would make me afraid enough to surrender the truth. They thought a badge, money, and threats could decide whose story survived. I am here because the story they tried to erase is now part of the record. The courtroom remained still. Mateo stared at the table. Cole looked away. Grace continued, voice steady. I do not ask this court for revenge. I ask for protection for every family they pressured before me, every report that was ignored, every person who learned to stay quiet because speaking up felt dangerous. Let the record show that we were not confused. We were not unstable. We were not standing in the way of progress. We were standing in the way of criminals. The judge denied Mateo's request for release, citing risk to witnesses, organized coordination, and the use of a minor as leverage. Deputy Cole's bond came with restrictions that barred him from law enforcement contact, evidence handling, and any communication with victims or witnesses. Preston Vale's passport was surrendered before lunch. Outside the courthouse, reporters called Grace a hero, but she did not stop for cameras. She put one hand on Caleb's shoulder and walked down the steps into the morning sun. The cameras followed anyway, catching the image that Bryan County would remember long after the headlines changed, a black farmer leaving federal court with her head high, her nephew safe beside her, while the men who tried to take her land, her reputation, and her family were led into rooms where their money, badges, and threats no longer opened doors. In the weeks after the arrests, Bryan County changed in ways that did not look dramatic from the highway but felt enormous to the people who had spent years lowering their voices. The first change came at the sheriff's office, where the front desk no longer had Deputy Cole Harlan leaning behind it like the county belonged to him. State investigators reviewed old reports, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. A barn fire on the Lawson place that had been called electrical. A poisoned well on the Sanders property that had been dismissed as contamination. A fence cutting on the Reed pasture that had been written off as teenage mischief. A widow who had reported threats 3 times before selling her land for half its value. Case by case, the files reopened, and with every reopened file, another family realized what had happened to Grace had not been an isolated cruelty. It had been a system of silence, built by criminals and protected by a badge that was never supposed to serve them. The sheriff announced new rules in a crowded town hall meeting that felt different from every meeting before it. Property crimes tied to land sales would now require outside review if any officer had a conflict of interest. Body cameras could no longer be turned off during missing person reports, fire investigations, or calls involving alleged threats. All evidence refusals, delayed dispatches, and officer contact with private developers had to be logged and audited. The word sounded bureaucratic, but to the people sitting in folding chairs under the fluorescent lights, they sounded like doors opening. Mrs. Alma Reed stood up first. She was 82, barely 5 feet tall, and her voice cut through the room like a bell. She told the investigators how her nephew had been followed for 3 days after refusing to sell a pasture. Then Mr. Lawson spoke about the night his barn burned and how Cole had told him insurance fraud would be easier to prove than arson. Then a woman named Denise Carter, who had not spoken publicly in years, stood with both hands shaking and admitted she had sold her parents' land because someone left photographs of her grandchildren in her mailbox. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. For once, nobody called fear confusion. The town listened. At Miller's Feed and Hardware, Mr. Miller placed a small sign near the register that said, "Security footage is preserved off-site." It was not a threat. It was a promise. People who had once pretended not to hear Deputy Cole warning Grace now came in and apologized, some awkwardly, some with tears, some too ashamed to meet her eyes when she stopped by for fencing nails. Grace accepted the apologies without making them easy. She never humiliated anyone, but she never erased what had happened either. Next time, she told one man who had watched Cole insult her in the store, "Do not wait until the brave thing is safe." The man nodded because there was nothing else to say. Vale Renewables lost its county contract, then its investors, then the office on Main Street with the polished glass windows and green banners about progress. The county council suspended every pending land acquisition connected to the company and created a legal review fund for families who believed they had signed under pressure. Naomi Brooks helped arrange pro bono attorneys from Atlanta and Macon, and Grace gave them every document she had collected, not because she wanted attention, but because evidence became stronger when it protected more than one person. 7 families filed civil claims. 2 got their land options cancelled. 1 elderly couple recovered a pasture that had been taken through a fraudulent lien. For the first time in years, farmers along County Road 18 started leaving porch lights on at night, not because they were unafraid, but because they no longer felt alone in the dark. Caleb changed too. He went back to school after a week, quieter than before but not broken. At first, students stared at him in the hallway the way people stare at someone who has become a headline without asking to be one. Then his history teacher asked the class what civic courage meant, and Caleb, who had spent years trying not to draw attention, raised his hand. He did not tell them everything. He did not talk about the warehouse or the fear in his chest or the sound of Mateo's voice over the phone. He told them that courage was not always running toward danger. Sometimes it was keeping the line open, remembering details, telling the truth clearly, and trusting that the truth needed structure if it was going to survive. After that, students stopped staring at him like a victim. They started asking how to help rebuild. The first Saturday after the hearings, trucks began arriving at Whitaker Farm before 8 in the morning. Mr. Miller brought lumber. Mrs. Alma brought biscuits wrapped in towels. The Lawson boys brought tools. The volunteer fire captain from the neighboring county brought a crew that had no official reason to be there and every moral reason in the world. People who had once driven past Grace's open gate without stopping now stood in her field with work gloves on, waiting for instructions. Grace looked at them for a long moment, the ruins of the old barn behind her and stacks of fresh timber at her feet. She could have turned them away. Pride would have understood that. Pain would have justified it. Instead, she handed Mr. Miller a measuring tape and told Caleb to mark the first post line. The new barn did not go up in a day, but the first frame rose before sunset, square and steady against the sky. As people worked, stories came out. Quiet ones. Old ones. Stories of threats, bad deals, reports ignored, and neighbors too scared to stand together. The rebuilding became more than carpentry. It became testimony without microphones. By evening, Grace stood beside Naomi near the pasture fence, watching Caleb help set a beam with 3 other boys from school. Naomi said, "You know this case is going to keep growing." Grace nodded. "Good. That may mean more attention on you." Attention fades. She looked across the farm, where hammers rang and voices carried in the golden light. Records stay. Naomi studied her for a second. "You really were never doing this just for your barn." Grace's eyes moved to the new frame rising where the old one had burned. They wanted every family out here to believe they could be picked off one at a time. So the answer had to be bigger than me. As the sun dipped low, Mrs. Alma asked everyone to stop for a moment. No speech had been planned, but silence spread across the field until even the children quieted. Grace stepped forward, not to thank them like a politician, not to perform forgiveness, but to name what had changed. "This land survived because people finally told the truth together," she said. "Do not forget how much that matters." No one clapped at first. They simply stood with the weight of it. Then Caleb picked up a hammer, tapped it once against a new post, and the sound carried across Whitaker Farm like a promise. The cartel had come to Bryan County teaching people to stay silent. Grace Whitaker had answered by making the truth organized, witnessed, and impossible to bury again. 3 months later, the new barn caught the morning light before the farmhouse did. Its cedar boards were still clean, its roof still bright, and the fresh white letters above the door read Whitaker Farm, since 1949. Grace stood in the open doorway just after sunrise with a coffee cup in one hand and a brass nail in the other, the last piece of the old barn she had saved from the ashes. She had cleaned it, not to keep the pain alive, but to remember what fire had failed to take. Behind her, Caleb swept the center aisle with music playing softly from his phone, taller somehow than he had been before, not because his body had changed, but because he carried himself like a boy who had learned fear could be survived without letting it become his master. The farm was not the same. There were new cameras on the fence lines, new locks on the gates, and a direct emergency contact card taped inside the kitchen cabinet beside the fire extinguisher. The sheriff's office had new faces, the county had new rules, and men who once spoke in whispers now stood straighter at town meetings. But Grace knew healing was not the same as pretending nothing happened. Healing was what came after truth had been named, after justice had begun, after the people who looked away learned the cost of silence. She walked to the back wall of the barn, where Caleb had built a small wooden shelf without telling her. On it sat the old family saddle, her father's rusted horseshoe, a framed copy of the original deed, and the faded photograph from the wooden box. Caleb had placed it there carefully, not in the center, not like a trophy, but beside the family things where it belonged. Grace looked at the younger version of herself in uniform and felt no need to hide her anymore. She also felt no need to become her again. Caleb leaned on the broom and watched her. "Do you ever miss it?" Grace knew what he meant. The call sign. The missions. The version of her that Mateo had discovered too late. She took a slow breath, smelling sawdust, hay, and Georgia morning air. "I miss the people," she said. "Not the reasons we had to be there." Caleb nodded, thinking about that. "I used to think being strong meant making people afraid of you." Grace turned toward him. "That is what weak men think strength is." "Then what is it?" She looked out through the barn doors, across the pasture where new fence posts stood in a straight line and the first corn rows moved gently in the wind. "Strength is knowing what you can do and still choosing what is right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the brass nail from her hand and set it on the shelf beside the deed. "Then this stays here," he said. Grace smiled, small but real. Later that afternoon, neighbors gathered at the farm for the first harvest meal since the arrests. Mrs. Alma brought peach cobbler. Mr. Miller brought folding tables. The Lawson family brought chairs, and the children ran between the porch and the pasture without anyone telling them to stay close. Naomi Brooks came too, not as a prosecutor this time, but as a guest carrying a pie from a bakery in Macon because she admitted she could not bake one herself. Daniel Reeves sent a letter instead of appearing, short and plain, the way Grace preferred. "Blackbird, you protected the truth without becoming the war again. That is the hardest shot any of us ever take." Grace read it once in the kitchen, folded it, and placed it inside the wooden box before joining everyone outside. As sunset settled over Whitaker Farm, Caleb stood beside her at the fence and watched gold light spill across the new barn. "Do you think they will remember what happened?" he asked. Grace looked at the people gathered around the tables, laughing softly, telling stories, passing plates, no longer strangers to one another's fear. "Some will remember the fire," she said. "Some will remember the arrests. Some will remember the headlines." She rested her hand on the top rail. "But the ones who matter will remember that silence almost cost us everything, and truth saved more than one family." Caleb looked at her, then back at the barn. The scars of the old fire were still visible in the soil if someone knew where to look, but around them the grass had already started growing back. Grace did not need revenge to feel whole. She did not need Mateo's fear, Cole's shame, or Preston's downfall to define her victory. Her victory was simpler and stronger than that. Her nephew was safe. Her name was clean. Her land still belonged to her family. And the community that once lowered its eyes had learned to stand in the open. When the first stars appeared over the pine trees, Grace closed the barn doors with both hands, slid the new lock into place, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The past was still behind her, but it no longer chased her. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer belonged to men who ruled by fear. Whitaker Farm breathed in the dark, steady and alive, and Grace walked back toward the porch light with Caleb beside her, carrying not just what had survived, but what had finally been restored.